All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty serious, a dangerous fungus called Candida auris. You might have heard it called a super fungus, and for good reason. It's popping up in hospitals, and we're going to break down the urgent game plan to fight this thing.
So, let's kick things off with a question that honestly sounds like it's straight out of a horror movie, but it's a very real challenge for our healthcare systems. What if a fungus could outsmart our best drugs and our strongest cleaners? What happens then?
Well, that question brings us right to our main subject today, a pretty new and, frankly, formidable fungus called Candida auris. You'll hear people call it C. auris for short.
Okay, so what exactly is this stuff? It's a type of yeast, right? But definitely not the kind you're thinking of for baking bread. Nope. This one loves to hang out in hospitals and other medical facilities, and it's a major threat to patients who are already really vulnerable. You know, people in the ICU, folks with weakened immune systems, that kind of thing.
But why this scary nickname? Why a super fungus? Well, it all comes down to a few key traits that make it just incredibly tough to get rid of.
And this is really what sets us apart. You see, a typical fungus, we can usually treat it with common antifungal drugs. But CRS, it's often resistant to multiple drugs. Not only that, it's a master of disguise in the lab, so it can be misidentified. And get this, it's resistant to a lot of standard hospital cleaners and can live on surfaces for a long time. It's basically a triple threat.
And that combination of being drug-resistant and super persistent, well, it has a devastating impact. We're talking about a mortality rate of over 50% for invasive infections. That's when it gets into the bloodstream. Just think about that. That is an incredibly lethal threat.
So with a threat that dangerous, you can't just wait for it to show up. The first line of defense has to be a proactive hunt. The whole strategy is to find this thing before it gets a chance to spread. And finding this thing really is like a full-on investigation. It all starts with a single doctor suspecting something's up. If they're right, it kicks off this whole chain reaction. The lab has to use very specific methods to make sure they don't misidentify it. And once a case is confirmed, boom, a massive contact investigation begins to trace every single person who could have been exposed. So where are they even looking for it? Well, the primary screening sites are on the skin, specifically the groin and armpits, because that's where the fungus often hangs out without even causing symptoms. But to be extra sure, they'll check other places too, like nostrils, the throat, any open wounds, even urine. The whole idea is to cast a really wide net so you don't miss anyone carrying it. Okay, so once they've found a patient who has it, whether they're just carrying it or are fully infected, the game changes. The next phase is all about containment. I mean, we're talking about building a virtual fortress around them to stop this thing from spreading any further. So how do they do that? There are two main strategies. The best case scenario is a single private room, preferably with its own bathroom. But if that's not possible, they'll do something called cohorting. That's where they group all the patients with C. auris together in one designated area or room. But listen, it's not just about the room. Containment is a whole multi-layered defense system. We're talking dedicated medical equipment that's either single-use or never leaves that patient's area. In really high-risk places like ICUs or oncology units, they even recommend dedicated staff. And the patient's movement? Tightly controlled. They only leave for absolutely essential procedures, and even then with super strict precautions. And here's the kicker. Because this fungus is so ridiculously stubborn and can survive in the environment, just isolating the patient isn't enough. You have to clean the battlefield itself, the actual hospital room, and not just with any old cleaner. This is a huge deal. A lot of the normal, everyday cleaners that hospitals use, they just don't work on CRS. They're totally ineffective. So to actually kill it, facilities have to bring out the big guns, sporicidal disinfectants. And what's the most effective weapon in that arsenal? Usually it's something chlorine-based. Think a really, really powerful version of bleach. And they're not messing around with the strength either. The guidelines are super specific. For just the daily cleaning while a patient is still in the room, they need a concentration of 2,000 parts per million of chlorine. But for what's called a terminal clean, that's after the patient leaves, that concentration more than doubles to a whopping 5,000 parts per million. That just shows you the sheer force needed to wipe this thing out. So you've got this fungus that's incredibly persistent, both in the environment and on a person. That leads to a pretty big question. How does this battle actually end for a patient? And that brings us to one of the most critical questions in managing any outbreak, really. When is a patient finally safe to leave isolation? How do you know for sure that they're no longer a carrier and won't spread it to someone else?
Well, because this fungus is so dang persistent, the rules for getting out of isolation are, as you can imagine, incredibly strict. First, at least a month has to have passed since their last positive test. Then, they need the green light from an expert, like an infectious disease doctor. And the final step, the patient has to provide 3 consecutive negative screening samples, taken from multiple body sites, and each at least 24 hours apart. Yeah, anything less than that and the risk of starting a whole new outbreak is just way too high.
You know, this whole complex strategy for fighting Candida auris, from the proactive hunting to the fortress-like isolation and the extreme deep cleaning, it really shines a light on a much bigger challenge, doesn't it? It leaves us with this really critical question to think about for the future. As microbes keep evolving to survive everything we throw at them, how must our hospitals evolve right alongside them to keep us safe?